Hi everyone, welcome to the second episode of the Cloud Security Lounge. Today, Izar and I are proud to welcome Zack. Zack is working as the lead of security research and threat detection teams here at Datadog along with us. Zack also has a newsletter on threat detection engineering. He has a really security and threat focused background that he will share with us. Just now, Zack, the floor is yours.
Thanks, JB. Really happy to be here. And yeah, so basically what I do here at Datadog is I help run the threat detection and security research mission for our security products. And so that involves working with not only the product teams to help protect our customers, but also our internal security teams to kind of bridge that gap and make sure that we're not only building great things for our products, but we're also using them internally and we're dog fooding them, so to speak.
Yeah, thanks for the intro. So I think our topic today is around account takeover, which is something that a lot of people don't really know about until you faced one and you've been breached. I don't know, was any of you already victim of like password theft or something like that? Izar?
Well, I get emails from have you been pwned every 15 minutes, so I'm guessing that I'm out there.
Yeah, same here. So whether it's have I been pwned or any of the other few services, I feel like it's a weekly occurrence. So I think it just kind of goes to show how prevalent data theft is and how exposed we are in terms of having hundreds of accounts that we have to remember all these things on.
And so, Zack, you've been really involved into some data breach and account takeover stories. So would you be able to share a bit more and what you used to do in those kind of
Sure.
affairs?
Yeah, so I was the senior director of threat intelligence at a company called ZeroFox before I joined Datadog. And one of the big things that I was responsible for there was the acquisition of stolen breach data and using that to find customers and kind of provide them with as much data as possible to make sure they can reduce any type of exposure they had. So, jumping on things like the dark web and cyber criminal forums and kind of seeing how things were traded or how things were given away, downloading all those things and kind of seeing like, all right, who's been exposed, how many of these people are customers, and how can we go and give them what they need in order to change passwords or adjust their threat models and things like that.
Cool. Zack, one thing before we go into the meat of what we're talking about today. In the minds of people, whenever they hear data breach and things like that, usually it's the hacker in the basement with the hoodie, typing very fast, crazy commands, crazy
black
methodologies.
T-shirts. Yep.
Black t-shirts. Good guys wear black too. And the thing that I wanted to ask you is, in the grand scheme of things, would it be right to say that a lot of the breaches that we see basically start and come from ATO, from account takeovers, from credentials that are lost, missed, misplaced, found, breached, whatever? How would you put this like one thing against the other between the high-end techniques and ATO?
Yeah, look, I think you're spot on here, Izar. A lot of what you see in terms of personal data breaches or even larger ones are not really the result of like a super crazy Uber hacker that won like the DEF CON CTF, right? What you see is that a lot of the times these breaches are the result of wearing down a human. And what I mean by that is that, whether you have a phone that's pushing something saying like, hey, someone's trying to log on. Of course you would say like, this doesn't look like me, I'm going to press no. But imagine getting a notification every 10 seconds that someone's trying to log on. That is when these breaches happen, is because humans are kind of not really looking at the way that these attackers are tiring us out. And so eventually you're going to want your phone to stop ringing. And so you're going to say, you know what, screw this. I'm going to press approve. I don't want to see this anymore. It's 1 a.m. And then that's the result of a lot of these breaches, right? And this is not just phones. This can be something along the lines of like password reset emails, even to the point of things like SIM swapping, where a SIM card is stolen and then it's kind of taken over. And that might happen when you're sleeping, or that may happen and you don't really have a lot of sense of urgency around it. And these types of low-tech attacks are extremely effective.
Yeah, and something that is pretty fun, and so I think I'm going to share my screen just for 1 minute and to give a sense to everyone of how widespread and easy to perform such attacks might be. It's to look at YouTube, for instance. And so you would just search for Sentry MBA, which is like one of the tools that some attackers use. And you can see immediately in the suggestions, you have Sentry MBA Netflix. So that was pretty surprising to me the first time I saw that. But then, okay, you can just have a video that will tell you how to actually use Sentry MBA to try to find so I'm trying to find an actual screenshot of the tool. We'll get there. Yes, so that's one of the tools that is used by attackers just to manage finding stolen accounts or actually accounts that work. And maybe Zach, you can tell us a bit more about that.
Sure. Yeah. So what I was talking about previously were very targeted attacks. And this is definitely the result of an account takeover of like a very high value target. Let's just say a DevOps engineer, software engineer, security engineer, someone in finance, someone in HR. But there's also a numbers game associated with account takeover. If you happen to have access to the same data sets that a service like Have I Been Pwned has, Have I Been Pwned won't give you the password that is breached. They'll just say this account was breached on this domain. But many of those data sets have the passwords, or at least the password hashes available. If you can get access to those things, that's when you can start automating and scripting out a lot of this account takeover. And so you happen to have an access to a database that has a couple million usernames and passwords. You can kind of assume that most of these people probably have access to kind of like commodity platforms like Amazon, Netflix, social media accounts, and things like that. You can also probably surmise that some of these passwords may be one character off between platforms, because people in general still aren't using password managers enough. So if you can basically script out and assume those things, and you have 10 million, 20 million accounts to crack, even like a 1% success rate of cracking that is a few thousand accounts, right? And so Sentry MBA and they're like Open Bullet, a few other of these tools help you automate something like an attack at that scale.
But let's take a step back here for a second. I think that it's very important that we understand who are these people and what's the motivation. Like, why would somebody want my Netflix password?
Yeah, this is a great question. And I know I've talked about this a few times, but looking at the victimology, but also the criminology behind these types of attacks. The types of people that will go after this are usually, people that are in cybercrime, but not cybercrime like we think of ransomware. Cybercrime in the sense of like, hey, I'm going to do like these low-level types of crime that probably don't have a huge amount of financial impact, but I'm going to scale it across thousands and thousands of these accounts. And eventually, if I crack enough of these and I sell these to people that want a $5 Netflix account versus paying $15 a month, I can make pretty good margins on that. And so it's definitely like a tier list, but someone that goes and specializes in something like this, where they can sell many types of Netflix accounts, Amazon accounts, things like that, they can make a few $1,000s a month. And for most people in the world, that's a good living.
And that's JB, that's a very interesting point that it never fails to bring me back to the point that whenever we asking developers to think security and what they have to do and prevention and stuff like that, sometimes we tell them, hey, think like a hacker, which is something that doesn't happen. Right? Nobody just thinks about the techniques that they have to prevent. But when you put in terms of the economic incentive, as you did, that sometimes we think like these people and we think, I wouldn't go after something that gives me a bunch of $1,000 a month because it's not enough incentive. But when you transfer it to the, hey, there's something outside of our borders, there's a whole economic reality outside where a bunch of $1,000 a month is a lot. And that to me is more interesting in terms of thinking like a hacker than the specific techniques. What are the motivations around these people? So thank you. That's a great point.
And so we talked about the Netflix, the Amazons, but I think most of our listeners are actually owning productions, maybe at Amazon and Netflix, but also at companies that are not B2C. What kind of attacks and targets have you seen, if any, on non-B2C companies, Zach?
Yeah, it's a great question. So this is kind of graduating from, I would say, commodity accounts or commodity cybercrime to more specialized and things that we see in the news. And in the news, whether a big hack happened or a big arrest has happened, right? So, some of the biggest hacks at some of, these companies include going after internal portals. So, for example, imagine a B2B company that has internal support portals. And these internal support portals are used by customer support to go and help troubleshoot on behalf of customers. Maybe there's a relationship manager there. These are great targets for kind of more higher profile attackers that want to eventually move into something like data theft, ransomware, and things like that. And so you can really split this off and kind of say like, hey, what if I get into this B2B company and steal all their source code, maybe put it off somewhere on a server, and then email the CEO or email a bunch of reporters and say, I have this source code and I won't leak it unless you pay me $100,000. This has happened quite a few times in even the last few years. Some of the scarier ones include things around like telcos or any type of critical infrastructure type of companies, where if you have a malicious insider, and what a lot of these account takeover actors do is they'll text, LinkedIn message, send, even call some of these like internal support people on the phone and say, hey, listen, do you want to make a few $1,000s a week? Make a few switches in your internal system and I'll send you Bitcoin to do that. And to a lot of customer support people, again, to Izar's point, like outside of our borders, this is so much money. And so it's not just a technological problem. It can also move into an insider threat problem. And with that type of access, you could really take over and achieve a lot of objectives into more of these like B2B sales and B2B companies.
So I testified in one of those attacks when we were at Sqreen. One attack happened into our systems one night. It was actually one after a Sqreen party. So we were coming back home in a taxi with a friend, and at 2 a.m. We got a bunch of Sqreen notifications on our phone, and so we discovered that yes, we were under like a account takeover attack. So really distributed. It was like hundreds of IP addresses. So pretty hard to block because like the attackers were rotating the IPs very quickly, and it was focusing against, I don't know, like a few thousand users, and most of them were not part of Sqreen, but a few were. And so we've been monitoring the thing very closely. It lasted for like an hour and a half, but like we were super happy to have our account takeover heuristic to tell us about what was happening, because if you don't have that, well, you might see a peak of a spike in your logs, but otherwise those things are not trivial to detect because it's like the normal course of your application to validate and to reject passwords. So that's a dear memory of one faced attack, and so I guess you.
Yeah, it's scary. It's super scary to go through this because it's very personal. I feel like I don't know. I haven't been part of an incident where I was ransomware. My company was ransomware, but it's very much like a group of criminals versus a business. And of course, there's some personal attachment to it where it could affect business operations and it could affect your paycheck and things like that. But to be specifically targeted, like you and your account, it does feel like somebody like threatening you. It feels like it's a one-to-one interaction versus one-to-many interaction, and it's whether like how small it is or how big it is, it's very unnerving. It never feels comfortable, right?
So that's interesting. That takes me to my next question. So we spoke about motivations. We spoke about the people who are behind these attacks. Now we went a bit into how they happen, and are they personal or are they spray and pray? So can you take us a bit about on the life cycle of this whole thing, like how it starts, how do they get all these inputs, and from there?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So in general, it's a numbers game, like I said. And so it's a numbers game because we assume that breaches will happen, and those breaches have the latest state of somebody's online identity. Because you can kind of assume as time goes on, each one of us gets a have I been pwned email every week. We change our passwords. We're good internet citizens. But if you can get a very fresh piece of data from like a data breach, that is very valuable because it just shows that like it's almost like a 0 day. This person is unaware that this service has been breached. And so you have like the 0 day base, right? The 0 day database that says this hash is the current representation perhaps of like Zack's passwords. Once I have that, there are certain ways that you can kind of go through it and almost perform a like open source intelligence. Who are the people in this database? And those are the questions that a lot of these criminals ask themselves when they first get these things, especially if they're very good at targeting individual people. And so what I mean by that is a lot of the origins of these data breaches are for the sole purpose of finding folks to do account takeovers, to do SIM swapping, to drain a bank account, drain a crypto account, things like that. It's a very high payoff and it's very targeted. And so once you kind of go through that and it becomes less fresh and people update their passwords, then those data breaches and databases are either traded or sold to the point where the demand starts to lower because the supply is copied over and over again across the value chain. And then eventually it's just given away. And so at my last job, what we saw is a lot of the times we would see the databases be shared freely that are fresh for us as researchers, but are months to almost years old for a criminal. Once it gets to that point where it's given away, that's when you start to see this uptick, for the most part, of like spray and pray credential stuffing and account takeover attacks, because people are kind of picking up the smaller pieces and just kind of hoping that maybe they can get a commodity account or two out of these things.
And so once you have those, what do you do with it?
Once we kind of obtained those data breaches and databases.
Yeah, as an attacker, right?
Yes. Yeah. So you can do a few things. Most of the time, it's almost like a mad rush to crack passwords. Most of the time, not all the time, in modern kind of data breaches, you'll have hashed passwords. Hopefully it's there's a salt added. Hopefully it enforces some type of password standards. Many times they do not. You just start going to town, throw it into Jack the Ripper, pull in some word lists, maybe add a couple of variations on there, and you start to crack as much as possible.
So I'm not sure how familiar the audience will be with that. So let me just put some explanation on top of that, Zach. So when we say store hashed passwords, it means you store like the SHA or the bcrypt of the password. If you store the raw password, the plain text password, then obviously if your database got stolen, then attackers can directly use the passwords. If you store a hashed version of it, it's harder for the attackers because they first have to find a string that will end up like the hash, right? So this is called brute forcing. And when you said John the Ripper, Zach, it's like a tool that helps you brute force a variety of passwords.
Yes.
And so that's why it's critical for everyone to hash your passwords. And so the salt makes it even harder, etc. Zach, on you. Sorry for the...
Yeah, no problem. Go ahead, Azar.
So, Zach, just a parenthesis here. Okay, so we're talking about rich lists that come as hashes, and somebody has basically to crack them. Are we talking about different tiers of costs here? Like when they move from the hash to the decrypted already, do people have that whole economy of how much it costed me to decrypt this small amount of passwords? Is that incorporated in the sales value?
I would say, for the most part, there is a premium on that, but it's mostly based on, at least in my experience, who of the high value targets were cracked, and just kind of like the freshness of the data. Eventually, like password hash cracking, it has approached a state where it's not too hard to perform, cost wise as well as technology wise. So that premium is factored in, but once it kind of gets to the state where it's almost like a bunch of piranhas or circling around the scraps, it's not as worth it as much as it would be like something completely fresh.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. So basically, a lot of these people will go and crack these things with John the Ripper, and once they get those outputs, they'll mix and match. And what I mean by mix and match is that a data breach within itself is useful, but there are also these sets of data that you'll see people talk about called combo lists. And basically, a combo list is just a list of usernames and passwords that have been cracked or seen in the wild in a data breach. Once you mix and match these things, they eventually turn into a really nice data set of passwords and victims that you've known to see like in the wild as part of a data breach. And you can start doing small permutations, add an exclamation point, add a 1. If you see a date there, add a date, remove a date. And they're actually pretty thrifty at kind of building these things out. And then you'll start to get this like really big blob that you can go and load into these tools and just start rapid firing at all these different platforms.
Nice. The full attack life cycle. And so one of the things they use to stay kind of discreet is they don't want everything to come with one IP address usually. So could you let us know a bit more about how they manage to cycle that and find so many proxies?
Yeah, of course. So I'm sure everyone has probably faced this at one point in their life, but you go onto a website and let's just say you're at an airport or you're at an Airbnb on vacation or you're just away from home and you're presented a CAPTCHA. You have to fill in some ridiculous letter, number combination or look at a picture and say like, find everything in these 9 squares and mark them. That is a protection that is being put in place when a vendor sees an IP address it doesn't necessarily trust. And so the heuristic there is really anchored to the IP address. And so if you can kind of mark an IP address as maybe a little bit suspect, you can add additional layers of protection and investigation before you let this thing interact with your system. You can also just skip that if you happen to have enough ways to route your traffic through IP addresses that you know are fresh enough that maybe the platform doesn't have enough data on. So for example, if you say, I'm going to put a protection in place that says if we get 10 failed logins from an IP address, we're either going to block it or present a CAPTCHA. Well, if you have access to 10,000 IP addresses and you manage to do 10 different logins from each of those, that's going to be a lot harder to track on the platform side. And it gives you just a lot more access to try things quickly and find those accounts that are valid or have a good username and password that you have guessed.
Nice. So maybe one of I guess the next topic would be tools, right? So we discussed quickly CenturyMBA, Open Bullet. I can share that, but it was like a revelation to me when I realized that attackers use really some tool when I was a pen tester and I had like to run a brute force for a test I was doing. Usually it's a few lines of Python or whatever to just try an IP, a login and a password and just see if it's a failure or not. And obviously, if you don't test HTTP, well, okay, like SIP or SMTP or whatever, maybe you don't want to read the full RFC and you will use a custom tool. But actually, when you start to do it at scale for HTTP, well, then obviously you need multi-threading. You need to distribute the attack over several nodes, etc. And so that's where, yes, obviously you will need some more tools. But it's easy to see that very easily those kind of tools go beyond like simple pen testing, and those are more offensive requirements. So one of those tools is Patator. So I like it because it was written by Langelot, who's a friend and was a coworker in where I was a pen tester actually. So he wrote it while I was there. It's full Python, and you can see it's mostly like a brute force on a bunch of various protocols. So pretty fun. It's super easy to customize because it's a bunch of plugins that you have there, but very flexible and easy to, easy, I don't know, but at least very flexible. Actually, it's saying it's not script kiddie friendly. So one other tool that you mentioned, Zach, and that I think is much more tight into like the use case you described before is OpenBullet. And so we can see from the screenshots on GitHub that you have like a lot of settings that makes it really easy to use and really tight to the world of pen testing. So we'll share the links for those tools in our resume, in the episode summary. Is there any other tools that you have in mind, or maybe things that are much less public and that are reserved to some specific communities of hackers or?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, like these tools are probably like the biggest ones that I've seen, at least for this kind of large scale account takeover credential stuffing attacks. And it really comes back to what I said about it being a numbers game. The funny thing about brute force tools is that, I would do the same thing, GB. I would have something like that I would write, or maybe I would update burp to do something specific. But a lot of these tools are purpose built for one thing. And that one thing is account takeover. And if you go and look at the readmes of those tools, it says this is not used for account takeover. This is used for pen testing. But then you look at like the tabs, in that OpenBullet thing, it says load your proxies here, load your word list here, load your configs here. These are all things that are very specifically designed to target an authentication endpoint and to replace certain words within there and to measure a response and to see if that response indicates a successful login. So it's kind of hard for me to say like this is a pen test tool because it's clearly designed to do credential stuffing and account takeover. I guess if you want to use it for like a pen test job, great. But I've showed a couple screenshots to Zar and GB here, and there's a bunch of great work done on these tools. In the blogosphere, there are whole cybercriminal forum subcommittees designed just to talk about what is working for account takeover using these tools. So when it looks like a duck, it quacks like a duck, it's probably a duck, right? So,
which brings us to an important point that we are sharing these tools here and the details for research purposes, so that people can learn about them, learn how they work, and do their detections and all that good stuff.
Yes, of course.
Nice transition, Izar, because so yes, we talked a lot about offense here, but so I think the next question that will also be very interesting for everyone listening is watching us is how do you detect similar attacks? So what variety of tools? Who wants to start?
I can kind of give my 2 cents here. I think this is a great example of like purple teaming. So purple teaming is the combination of taking an attacker mindset, red teaming, pen testing like JB's talked about, and blue teaming on the defense side and kind of putting them together. A lot of the times these two teams, there's like a huge wall that separates them and they're kind of throwing stuff over, throwing ideas over in terms of here's what's vulnerable, here's what's been attacked, here's the type of defenses we have. But if you kind of tear down that wall and take that hacker or attacker mindset, you can actually go and clone these tools. You can run them against your infrastructure, and then you can look on the other side and see what kind of logs they generated or what kind of telemetry it's generated. And then you can make the decision, is this enough to catch this, or do we need to add more to make sure that we can specifically identify an attack like this? And so I'm a big fan of purple teaming and threat emulation and things like that. There's a couple names for it, but to kind of have something packaged to say, I'm going to run this attack in a controlled environment. I'm going to see what the telemetry is on the other side, and then I'm going to write monitors and detections to make sure I can catch it, is a really good way to kind of start adding coverage for this attack.
So what I'm hearing from you is that even if I do all my authentication from a third party, I can't just rely on the fact that they're responsible for that, and eventually if there's an attack like this, they'll be monitoring and let me know. There is an added component here of checking my own side, that shared responsibility, my logs, my apps, and see if something came true before they actually realized, right?
That's right, especially for like this username and password specifically login endpoint. So of course there are different ways you can do account takeover for like SAML-based authentication and single sign-on, but it's kind of outside the scope of like what OpenBullet and Sentry MBA and these large-scale cred stuffing attacks try to do.
And so you mentioned what kind of logs or telemetry. So one thing we can share is how we do account takeover detection at Datadog. So I'm gonna share quickly my screen. And so what we do specifically in ASM, ASM is working on services on top of the Datadog APM. So that means that any HTTP activity that is happening within your application is watched by the APM. And so from a security standpoint, we care about a subset of those. And for instance, everything that is login related, we obviously care about. So we're able to detect credential stuffing attacks. Here, that's an example on the Datadog demo application where we discovered like a huge spike of login attempts in which 18 logins were successful, and which translates into one compromised account. So that's like here we can see that's the admin user. So what can you do as a way to answer? Well, you could choose to block the IP, obviously, which is probably not enough. As an administrator of the application, what you want to do is probably lock the user account, revoke all existing sessions, and obviously change the password of the user. But so what's interesting is that the way this information is gathered from applications, you have several ways to do it. One of them is to use the framework that is used to perform authentication. That might be, I don't know, Spring Security in Java, Passport in Node, Django in Python, and by instrumenting those at the application level, you can know whether a specific request is performed by an authenticated user or whether it's a login attempt, and if the result is a success or a failure. And so the rule to detect that is super simple. We look if we have a lot of failed login, and we compare that rate to a threshold. So very simply, we can perform something like that. So it's super easy to adjust the rule to your infrastructure, and so if you want to adjust that, it's possible. The added value is that once this is done, you can have context about a specific user, and so you can look at what this specific user has been doing within your infrastructure. So what kind of attacks it performed, what kind of IPs they used, and the activity over time. So that's an interesting approach to monitor account takeovers. One other way to do it is to use SIEM, like SIEM platforms that will help you monitor logs directly. So that could be applicative logs. So here it's the same. We detected like a brute force attempt on one specific application, and the rule is very similar super simple. We just look if the number of login is greater than 5. So that's also very easy to customize and to answer there, either by blocking the IP as a first measure and obviously changing the password and revoking the user account. So that's how we do attack detection whether it's at the trace level within the application or at the log level. Have you seen similar approaches in the past, Zach?
I have not seen it specifically, but I have worked on this specific problem for years now. I mean, I've been writing WAF rules since, even in university, right? So, I helped write a lot of the original WAF for a large content delivery network, protecting all of its customers. And the problem I've always had is that threat detection, the level of visibility you get into the request is really a function of the type of observability you have into it. So access logs, for example, out of the box for Apache, they log very little. So one of the things I like to do when I was on pen test is if I would have a C2 framework, I would always make sure that I send my commands over a header that start with an X, because those are custom headers, and Apache and IIS don't log those by default. And what's really cool about doing threat detection for these types of attacks at Datadog is it's at the trace level. So because the code is instrumented, our teams can get really, really deep when it comes to writing the exact type of heuristic to find these attacks. So we start with almost all of the data instrumented versus very little amount of the data instrumented, and then we kind of tailor it to what we need. And so that's what's made it really fun to work on this specific product. And I know that the team in my org that works on this has had a lot of fun building it out too.
Okay, so we spoke the attack itself, we spoke detection, we spoke around the market. Now let's get to the end of the pipeline. How do we defend against it? And what are the things that we can put in front of this attack so that we lower the chances of being a victim of them?
So I think it's I don't want to say defense in depth because I feel like that's an easy answer here, but and maybe I'll become a CISO one day if that was my answer for everything. But I think seriously. I think when it comes to protection for this type of attack, there are a couple layers. First, really identify what's your public-facing attack surface when it comes to these types of authentication endpoints, and make sure that you can really tune your telemetry and your detection mechanisms around assuming that you're constantly under attack, or you could be under attack because something's publicly facing. I think the more interesting one, and this is something that a lot of the Uber had one, was account takeovers that happen on internal authentication portals. So I mentioned earlier, support portals and support links and VPN access, that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. Those are the more targeted attacks that I've seen become really wildly successful, because a support engineer may have a lot of access. A DevOps engineer or an SRE will have a lot of access to those internal systems. And if you just assume it's internal and it'll always remain internal, that's that's not the right approach, right? So if you can find a way to also instrument your telemetry and instrument your detection around internal and systems like that, it's going to make a response plane a little bit easier, right? And it almost, you approach it like an insider threat, that at any time your DevOps person could be compromised, and what access does that DevOps person have? That's when you should kind of start from there and then kind of work your way backwards.
Which is a great assumption, right? Yep.
Nice. And one big evolution that we've seen, I think, in the past years. Oh my God, I feel old because I think it was like maybe 2015 is like Beyond Corp, which was a way to move to centralize authentication, right, and to add a layer of context and intelligence on top of various logins. So it's something that we see some convergence towards, right? Is it something that you've witnessed as well, Zach?
Yeah, I think Google's Beyond Corp has been taken over by Zero Trust, and so Gartner probably captured that, and they're very happy about it now, and all the other marketing firms. So I think that it's very important way to kind of approach the threat model, right? Like assume that everything's kind of publicly facing, or assume that everything's internally facing, and then start your authentication mechanisms through there. And I think you get a lot of benefits for that. Of course, the trade-off would be complexity, right? And so, making sure you can instrument however complex your architecture is, and having those appropriate response plans and detection plans is probably going to be your best bet.
And I think it's important to bring out too that we look at the places where you would put your credentials as the places we would defend against this attack specifically. But sometimes we forget to look at other forms of access, other forms of authentication. And those go, okay, I don't have passwords there, so I'm fine. But you forget that, for example, somebody logging in as a support person and then using the SSH shared keys and everything to pivot everywhere, that's a second order result of an attack like this that people many times ignore. So keep your threat models up to date, people.
Yeah. I need a poster with that as a quote, like right in front of me of who is our.
All right.
And actually, that takes us to another interesting point, which we didn't touch. I can see the guy there in the back of the room going, 2FA, 2FA, 2FA. What's the role of 2FA in this whole thing?
This is another great question, because I talked a little bit about like 2FA and human fatigue at the beginning.
Yep.
It's obviously a great approach when it comes to that type of authentication, but we're starting to see bypasses on that. And the bypass isn't the 2FA technology itself, it's the session token. And so a lot of malware, if you look up Stealer malware, Redline Stealer is a really big one. I just put a couple things out in my newsletter around Aurora Stealer. A lot of these downstream kind of tools to use these session cookies are getting even easier and easier to use, to the point where it's like a Chrome or a Firefox plugin, where it says point to your session cookie, and then I'll point, let's just say I stole something from Azar, I point to his session cookie, go to gmail.com, and boom, I'm logged in as Azar. And so that has nothing to do with your password or your two-factor authentication kind of processes, everything to do with after that authentication process.
It's insane how how easy it sounds.
It's a solution.
It makes you feel like you have to just turn off everything and walk away very quick and never touch a computer again. Yeah.
And obviously, if you're on the endpoint, the authenticated browser, like it's game over.
Zack has a weekly newsletter where he has a lot of resources, and sometimes he goes into things like what we just discussed, and it's going to be in the materials as well. So definitely pay attention to that.
Absolutely. If you want to hear more about the threat hunter world, please subscribe. Thanks a lot, everyone. Have a great rest of the day. Thanks a lot for joining, Zach, and see you soon.
Of course. Thanks for having me.
It was great.